Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're exploring how texts represent cultures and societies, with a focus on Australian examples. In any text, representations are never neutral. They're shaped by perspective, power, and purpose. So instead of asking what Australian culture is shown, we ask, how is it represented? Whose perspective shapes it? And what social or political ideas does the representation reinforce or challenge? In Australia, cultural representation might involve depictions of Indigenous cultures and country Anglo-Australian traditions, migrant and multicultural communities, rural versus urban lifestyles, Australian values, mastership, egalitarianism, fair go, power relations shaped by colonization and settlement. Every representation is selective. For example, tourism ads show Australia as beaches, barbecues, and friendly locals, a sunny cultural stereotype. Indigenous self-representations, like those in Samson and Delilah or Total Control, reveal lived realities of disadvantage, community, resilience, and contemporary identity, not the frozen-in-time image tourism prefers. Media portrayals of migrants can range from model minorities to threat narratives shaping public perception. So always ask, what parts of Australian culture are highlighted and what's missing? Australia has a long history of outsider representations. Colonial diaries, newspapers, and early novels often described Indigenous peoples as primitive, threatening, or childlike, justifying colonization. In contrast, insider representations like Archie Roach's music, Tara June Winch's The Yield, Kim Scott's Taboo, Nayuka Gori's essays offer deeply lived perspectives about country, community, trauma, healing, and survival. Meanwhile, migrant voices in Australia, like Alice Pung, An Do, Maxine Beniba Clark, offer insider perspectives that challenge stereotypes about Asian Australian and African Australian identities. Outsider representations, like early Australian films portraying migrants as outsiders or threats, can perpetuate narrow or harmful narratives. Representing social hierarchies and power. Australia's social hierarchies involve Indigenous versus non-Indigenous Australians, class differences, private school versus public school, city versus rural, race and migration, gender and sexism, ability and disability, religion and secularism. 1. Reinforcing power. Some texts have historically shown white, Anglo-Australian culture as default or normal, Indigenous people as peripheral to the Australian story, migrants as comedic or threatening outsiders. Think older films like Crocodile Dundee or We of the Never Never. 2. Critiquing power. Modern texts often expose inequalities. The Tall Man investigates police brutality against Indigenous Australians. Stateless examines how refugees are treated in detention centers. The Drover's Wife, The Legend of Molly Johnson, critiques colonial patriarchy and racism. 3. Negotiating power. Many characters navigate these structures. In Lion, Saru must reconcile migrant identity, loss, and belonging. In Looking for Alibrandi, Josie navigates class, culture, and family expectation. In Mystery Road, Indigenous detectives push back against racist policing systems. Race and racialization. Australian texts often address race by showing the ongoing impacts of colonization, the racialization of African Australian or Muslim Australian communities, tensions around migration and Australian identity. Problematic representations include Indigenous people shown only in the past or as mystical figures, immigrant families portrayed as strict, strange, or comedic, media stereotypes about Sudanese youth or Muslim communities. The white savior narrative in some reconciliation-focused stories. Complex portrayals include Total Control, Indigenous political agency, The Australian Dream, systemic racism exposed through Adam Goode's story, The Hate Race, Maxine Beniba Clark's own voice on anti-black racism in Australia, Samson and Delilah, lived experience of marginalization and resilience, gender representation. Australian gender representations are shaped by outback masculinity, larrikin culture, traditional gender roles in migrant communities, women pushing against male-dominated institutions. Classic Aussie representations often show tough, stoic men, women as secondary characters or emotional support, rural men as heroes, e.g. bush myth-making. Modern texts challenge this. The Drover's Wife, play and novel, reframes colonial narratives with a feminist lens. Barron's shows complex female leadership. The AFLW movement challenges masculine sporting traditions. Writers like Hannah Kent and Charlotte Wood explore violence, community, and women's agency. Intersectionality matters. An Indigenous woman, a migrant woman, and an Anglo-Australian woman may all experience gender different. Marginalized voices. Marginalization in Australian texts often appears through Indigenous communities represented without agency, refugees shown as statistics, not people, queer Australians erased from historical stories, working class or rural characters simplified into stereotypes. Strong counter-representations include 7 types of ambiguity, multi-perspective narrative, Burrumbee Kids, Indigenous coming-of-age story. The Sapphires, reclaiming Indigenous women's narratives. Nam Lee's The Boat, humanizing refugee stories. Please Explain, First Australians in My Blood It Runs. All give marginalized people voice, interiority, and complexity. Dominant versus alternative representations. Dominant Australian narratives include Australia is a classless society. We're all multicultural and welcoming. The bush defines us. Racism is in the past. Everyone gets a fair go. Counter-representations challenge these ideas. The Tall Man exposes justice inequality. Samson and Delilah challenges myths about reconciliation. Stateless reveals harsh refugee policies. The Yield recenters Aboriginal language and country. Sweet Country dismantles romanticized colonial nostalgia. Cultural appropriation versus exchange. Australia has had significant debates about non-Indigenous artists using Indigenous styles, people wearing Indigenous symbols without understanding them, writers depicting Indigenous spirituality or dreaming stories without permission, appropriation, power imbalance, taking without permission, benefiting while the source culture faces oppression, exchange, collaboration, permission, mutual benefit. Examples: a non-Indigenous author writing dreaming stories without consultation, appropriation. Briggs collaborating with non-Indigenous artists on music, exchange. Practical framework. Ask: 1. What Australian cultures or groups appear? Urban, rural, Indigenous, migrant, working class. 2. How are they represented? Complex, stereotyped, forgotten. 3. What power structures appear? Colonial, racial, class, gender, regional. 4. What purpose does the text serve? Expose, challenge, sell, entertain. 5. What effect does the representation have on audiences? Reinforce myths, challenge assumptions, offer new perspectives.